In 1477, a Ming dynasty bureaucrat walked into an archive and burned 30 years of navigation records on purpose. In 2018, two Norwegian economists discovered that younger brothers are scoring lower on IQ tests than older brothers raised in the same household. And in 2010, a complexity scientist published a single page in Nature predicting that the United States would hit peak political instability around 2020, based on a model he built from medieval agrarian data. Those three facts are the same story, and when you see how they connect, the version of generational conflict you carry in your head right now, the one where it is just culture wars and arguments about whom had it harder, falls apart. What replaces it is a structural pattern that has been identified independently by scholars across 2,400 years, measured in peer-reviewed data and modeled mathematically by three separate frameworks that disagree about almost everything except the date. Tonight, we are going to walk through all of it, from Plato's 5-stage decay sequence to Ibn Khaldun's 120-year clock, from the Bratsburg-Roberg IQ reversal to Gallup surveys where less than 17% of Generation Z trust Congress, from a GPS study that found your brain physically shrinks when you stop navigating to a 1433 treasure fleet whose records were burned because the next generation decided the ocean was a mistake. And by the end, you will understand why the phrase society works has never meant the same thing to any two generations alive at the same time, and why that is not a complaint. It is the mechanism. Get comfortable, settle in. If you are not subscribed, join up. And if you want more of this kind of thing across physics, history, collapse, and the mathematics underneath all of it, I do deeper cuts on Patreon. Big shout out to Own 3D Portable for inspiring this one. Stay for this one though, because the ending is where three independent models point to the same window, and the window is already open. Let's start where it started. In 1477, a bureaucrat named Liu Daxia walked into the archives of the Ming Ministry of War in Nanjing and removed every document related to the 7 treasure fleet voyages of Zheng He. Charts, logbooks, crew manifests, navigational records covering nearly 3 decades of the largest naval expeditions in human history. 300 ships, 28,000 men. Voyages that reached the east coast of Africa 60 years before the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope. And Liu Daxia took the records, and according to the account preserved in Yan Kongjian's Shuyu Zhouzi Lu, his stated reason was that these documents contained deceitful exaggerations of bizarre things, far removed from the testimony of people's eyes and ears, and that future generations might be tempted to imitate them. Think about that for a second. A government official deliberately destroyed the proof that his civilization had accomplished something extraordinary, because he was afraid a future generation might try to do it again. And within 50 years, Ming China could no longer build ocean-going ships. The shipyards were dismantled. By 1525, it was illegal to construct a vessel with more than 2 masts. The largest warships in the Jiajing era measured maybe 30 meters. Zheng He's flagships had been over 120. The knowledge was not lost gradually. The way we imagine civilizations decline, it was removed on purpose by the people who inherited it, because they had decided, for reasons that made perfect sense to their generation, that the previous generation's greatest achievement was a mistake. I have spent an unreasonable amount of time reading about this, not because it is an interesting footnote about Chinese maritime history, although it is that, but because this pattern, a generation deliberately erasing or redefining what the generation before it built, shows up everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean in Plato, in Polybius, in a 14th century North African historian writing in a cave, in a German sociologist in 1928, in Norwegian military IQ data from 2018, in a Gallup survey from 2023, where they asked Generation Z how much they trust Congress, and the answer was less than 17%. And the reason I need to tell you about all of this is that there is a question sitting underneath our entire civilization right now that almost nobody is asking correctly. The question is not whether different generations disagree. Of course they disagree. That is obvious. The question is whether the specific way they disagree, the precise nature of the gap between what your parents mean when they say society works and what you mean when you say society works, is not a cultural annoyance, but a structural feature, a feature that shows up before every major civilizational collapse in recorded history, a feature that has been independently identified and measured by scholars across 2,400 years, and a feature that 3 separate modern mathematical models built from completely different datasets in completely different academic disciplines have converged on the same prediction about. That prediction pointed to a specific window. The window opened around 2020. We are inside it right now, and the people who built the models have been publishing their findings in peer-reviewed journals for over a decade. I will show you the papers. I will show you the data. And by the end of this, you will understand why no government, no institution, and no mainstream commentator has any incentive to tell you what the models actually say. But before any of that makes sense, you need to see the pattern. And the pattern starts 2,400 years ago, with a philosopher who watched democracy eat itself and decided to write down exactly how it happens. Plato wrote the Republic around 380 BCE, and most people who have heard of it know the allegory of the cave. Shadows on a wall, prisoners mistaking projections for reality, the whole thing. What gets far less attention is Book 8, where Plato lays out something much more specific and much more disturbing. He describes the 5 stages of political decay, and he is explicit that the mechanism driving the decay from one stage to the next is generational. Not economic, not military. Generational. It works like this. The ideal state, what Plato calls aristocracy in the old sense of rule by the best, is founded by people who value wisdom above everything. But their sons, raised in comfort rather than forged by necessity, begin to value honor and military glory more than wisdom. That is timocracy. The sons of the timocrats, having grown up surrounded by the spoils of military prestige, begin to value wealth more than honor. That is oligarchy. The sons of the oligarchs, resentful of inherited privilege they did not earn, tear down the wealth hierarchy in favor of radical equality. That is democracy. And the sons of the democrats, raised with total freedom and no memory of why the constraints existed in the first place, become so accustomed to liberty that they cannot tolerate any authority at all. Society fragments. Faction fights faction. And the people, exhausted by chaos, hand power to a strong man who promises order. That is tyranny. 5 stages. 4 generational transitions. Each generation redefining what good governance means based on the specific conditions they grew up in, with no experiential access to the conditions their grandparents faced. Plato is not describing a political theory. He is describing a transmission failure. Each generation receives the institutional inheritance of the previous one, but lacks the formative experience that made those institutions make sense. So they redefine the terms. They keep the word society. They keep the word works. But what they mean by those words is fundamentally different from what the generation before them meant. And the gap between the definitions is the crack the collapse travels through. Now, Plato was a philosopher. You could argue he was just telling a story. But 240 years later, a Greek historian named Polybius looked at the same pattern and gave it a name: Anacyclosis, the cycle of constitutions. And Polybius was not a philosopher speculating from an armchair. He was a hostage of Rome who had direct access to the Roman Senate and who spent decades studying how governments actually function and fail. His histories, written around 140 BCE, dedicate the entire 6th book to this cycle, and his language is remarkably precise. Polybius argued that every form of government contains the seed of its own degeneration. Monarchy degenerates into tyranny. Tyranny provokes aristocracy. Aristocracy degenerates into oligarchy. Oligarchy provokes democracy. Democracy degenerates into mob rule, and mob rule provokes a return to monarchy. But the critical insight, the one that matters for what I am about to show you, is his explanation of why the degeneration happens. Polybius says it is because virtue cannot be inherited. The founders of each system earned their authority through struggle. Their descendants received it as a birthright, and the experience of earning something and the experience of inheriting something produce fundamentally different people who hold fundamentally different beliefs about what the system is for, even though they use the same words to describe it. Polybius actually describes the democratic generation in terms that will sound uncomfortably familiar. He writes about the grandchildren of democracy's founders, who have become so accustomed to freedom and equality that they no longer value them and begin to aim at preeminence. They do not want equal treatment. They want special treatment. And they believe they deserve it because they have no memory of what the absence of freedom actually felt like. Their grandparents built the system to prevent tyranny. They used the system to pursue status. Same institution, same vocabulary, completely different definition of what it is supposed to do. And here is where the pattern starts to get unsettling, because neither Plato nor Polybius had access to what came next. In 1377, a North African historian named Ibn Khaldun was living in a castle in Khalat ibn Salama in what is now Algeria, and he wrote the Muqaddimah, which is one of the most extraordinary books in human history, and which almost nobody in the Western world has read. The Muqaddimah is essentially the first attempt at a science of history. Ibn Khaldun looked at the rise and fall of North African and Middle Eastern dynasties across centuries and identified a pattern so consistent he believed it was a law. The concept at the center of his theory is called Asabiyyah, which roughly translates to group cohesion or social solidarity. The idea is this: a dynasty or civilization is founded by a group with strong Asabiyyah, people bound together by shared hardship, mutual dependence, and a common identity forged under pressure. The first generation builds, the second generation consolidates. They remember the struggle even if they did not live through the worst of it. But the third generation is raised in luxury. They have no experiential memory of the conditions that created the solidarity. They inherit the wealth, the institutions, the language of cohesion, but not the feeling, not the thing that actually held it together. Ibn Khaldun writes, and I want you to hear his actual words, because they were written 650 years ago, and they sound like they were written yesterday. The third generation has completely forgotten the desert life and the conditions that went with it, as though they had never existed. They have lost the taste for group feeling because they are dominated by force. Luxury has reached its peak among them because they are so much given to a life of ease and leisure. The fourth generation presides over collapse, and they are replaced by a new group from the margins, one with stronger Asabiyyah, and the cycle begins again. Ibn Khaldun put a number on it: 3 to 4 generations, roughly 120 years. That is how long it takes for a civilization to forget why it exists. And that number, derived from observation of medieval North African dynasties by a man writing by candlelight in a castle in Algeria, matches with disturbing precision numbers produced by modern mathematical models built from completely different data, using completely different methods 6 centuries later. I will show you those models, but first you need to understand why this is not just an interesting historical curiosity. You need to understand what happens when you take Ibn Khaldun's cycle and apply it to the question of what each generation actually means when it says society works. Because the answer is that they do not mean the same thing. They have never meant the same thing. And the divergence between their definitions is not random. It follows a pattern that has been measured, quantified, and published in peer-reviewed journals. And the pattern has a shape, and the shape looks like collapse. In 1928, a German sociologist named Karl Mannheim published an essay called Das Problem der Generationen, the problem of generations. And it remains to this day the most rigorous theoretical framework anyone has ever built for understanding why people born 20 years apart can look at the same society and see completely different things. Mannheim was not writing pop psychology. He was not creating listicles about which generation likes avocado toast. He was asking a precise philosophical question. How is it possible for people who share the same physical space, the same government, the same economy, the same language, to hold fundamentally incompatible models of what is real? His answer has 3 layers, and each layer is more disturbing than the last. The first layer is what he called generational location, or Generationslagerung in the original German. This is simply the fact that being born at a particular moment in historical time places you in a specific position relative to the events unfolding around you. You do not choose this position. It is imposed on you by when you happened to arrive. And it determines, with a rigidity that Mannheim found alarming, which events will form the scaffolding of your understanding of reality. But location alone is not enough. Mannheim's second layer is what he called generation as actuality. This is the moment when a cohort stops being a passive collection of people born around the same time and develops a self-conscious identity in response to a shared shock. A war, a financial collapse, a pandemic, a technological revolution. The shock does not affect everyone equally, but it creates a before and after in the minds of the people who lived through it. And that before and after becomes the organizing principle for everything that follows. How they think about risk, how they think about authority, how they think about whether institutions can be trusted. And then the third layer, the one that should genuinely unsettle you. Mannheim identified what he called Generationseinheiten, generation units. These are antagonistic subgroups within the same generational actuality that respond to the same shock with incompatible worldviews. Not just different priorities, incompatible maps of reality. His empirical case was the generation of young Germans who came of age during and after World War I. They shared the same traumatic shock. They shared the same generational location, but they split into violently opposed factions, radical left and radical right, both of which were authentic responses to the same catastrophe, and both of which were completely incommunicable to the pre-war generation and to each other. And here is the part of Mannheim's essay that almost never gets quoted, because it is too uncomfortable for the people who study generations professionally. Mannheim noted that whether a generational cohort develops a distinctive consciousness at all depends on the tempo of social change. In slow-changing societies, generations blend into each other. The differences are marginal. The definitions of basic concepts like justice, authority, and fairness shift gradually enough that everyone can stay on the same page. But in fast-changing societies, in societies undergoing rapid technological or social transformation, the definitions do not shift gradually, they rupture. And when they rupture, you get what José Ortega y Gasset, working in parallel in Spain, called generations polémicas. Combat generations. Generations that are not just different from each other, but structurally opposed. Generations that cannot share a single description of what is happening, because what is happening looks fundamentally different depending on which set of formative experiences you carry. I need you to understand that this is not a metaphor. This is not a poetic way of saying that people disagree about politics. Mannheim is making a precise claim. He is saying that the formative experiences of your youth, roughly between the ages of 15 and 25, construct a cognitive filter that determines what information you can even perceive as relevant, not what opinions you hold, what information your brain will process as meaningful. And two people with different cognitive filters can look at the same data, the same economy, the same institution, and literally not see the same thing. In 2014, two economists named Paola Giuliano and Antonio Spilimbergo published a paper in the Review of Economic Studies called Growing Up in a Recession. They used the US General Social Survey, which has been running since 1972, and they exploited regional variation in macroeconomic conditions to test a specific hypothesis. Does experiencing a recession during your impressionable years, between ages 18 and 25, permanently change your beliefs about how society works? The answer was yes, and the effect was not small. People who came of age during a recession permanently believe that success is more about luck than effort. They permanently support more government redistribution. They permanently vote further to the left. And they permanently trust public institutions less. The effects persist decades after the recession ends. Giuliano and Spilimbergo found that the magnitude of this imprinting is roughly equivalent to the effect of several additional years of formal education on those same beliefs. And it is about 50% larger than the effect of actually being personally unemployed. Let me say that again. The experience of growing up during an economic crisis shapes your beliefs about society more powerfully than the experience of personally losing your job. Not because it is more painful, but because it happens during the window when your brain is constructing its model of how the world works. Giuliano and Spilimbergo published a follow-up review in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2025, replicating across more countries and more time periods, and they confirmed that the impressionable years window, 18 to 25 with 26 to 33, also showing effects, is the critical window for political belief formation. But they found something additional that complicates the picture. In some country period combinations, the crisis era cohort shifts right, not left. The direction depends on the specific nature of the shock and the institutional context, but the mechanism is the same. The shock during the impressionable years rewrites the operating system permanently. So when I tell you that different generations disagree about what society means, I am not talking about arguments at Thanksgiving dinner. I am talking about neurologically embedded cognitive frameworks that were burned into the brain during a specific developmental window, and that cannot be overridden by subsequent experience. Mannheim suspected this in 1928. Giuliano and Spilimbergo proved it in 2014. And the implications are worse than either of them said out loud. Because if every generation's model of society is shaped by the specific conditions of its youth, and if those conditions change rapidly enough to produce incompatible models within the same population, then the phrase society works does not have a stable meaning. It cannot have a stable meaning. It is a moving target that shifts with every cohort, and the people using it in any given decade are not describing the same thing. That is not even the disturbing part. The disturbing part is what happens to competency while the definitions are shifting. Because it turns out that while each generation is busy redefining what society works means, the actual ability of the population to do the things that make society work is changing too. And it is changing in a direction that nobody wants to talk about. In 2018, two Norwegian economists named Ole Rogeberg and Bernd Bratsberg published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Volume 115, Issue 26, that should have been front-page news in every country in the developed world. It was not. The paper is titled Flynn Effect and its reversal are both environmentally caused. And what it shows is this. For most of the 20th century, IQ scores went up. This is called the Flynn effect, named after James Flynn, who documented it across 14 nations in two papers published in Psychological Bulletin in 1984 and 1987. The gains were roughly 3 points per decade, with the largest increases 5 to 6 points per decade, showing up on tests of fluid reasoning, the kind of abstract problem solving that has nothing to do with education or cultural knowledge. For decades, this was treated as one of the most robust findings in all of psychometrics. Every generation was measurably smarter than the one before it. And then it stopped. And then it reversed. What Rogeberg and Bratsberg did that no one had done before was use Norwegian military conscription data covering every male birth cohort from 1962 to 1991. That is 3 decades of data covering the entire male population of a country. And they found that IQ scores peaked for cohorts born in the mid-1970s and have been declining since at a rate of roughly 0.33 IQ points per year. That is about 3 points per decade, the exact same rate as the Flynn effect, but in the opposite direction. Now, here is why this paper changed the conversation. Previous researchers had observed IQ declines in various countries: Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK. Teasdale and Owen published similar findings for Denmark in 2005 and 2008. Dutton and Lynn documented it for Finland in 2013. But every time the decline was reported, the same objections were raised. Maybe it is immigration changing the demographic mix. Maybe it is dysgenic fertility, meaning less intelligent people having more children. Maybe it is a selection effect in who takes the tests. Rogeberg and Bratsberg eliminated all of those explanations in a single move. They looked at brothers. Same family, same parents, same household, same genetic pool, same socio-economic environment. And the younger brothers scored lower than the older brothers. The decline shows up within families, between siblings who share everything except their birth year, which means the cause is environmental. Something in the environment is making each successive micro-cohort perform worse on tests of abstract reasoning than the one immediately before it. And the declines are sharpest in exactly the cognitive domains you would expect to deteriorate if a population were outsourcing its thinking to machines. Fluid reasoning, mathematical problem solving. The very capacities that calculators, GPS systems, search engines, and now artificial intelligence have been progressively removing from daily cognitive life. I want to make sure the weight of this lands properly. For the entire 20th century, every generation was measurably more capable than the one before it. At abstract reasoning, the curve was going up, reliably, across countries, and then, starting with people born in the mid-1970s, it turned around. and it has been going down ever since. In Norway, at least, in Denmark, in Finland, in France, the picture is country dependent. Platt, Keyes, McLaughlin, and Kaufman published a study in Intelligence in 2019, looking at over 10,000 American adolescents, and found that the US might still be showing gains on some measures. So this is not a clean, universal story. But the trend in multiple developed nations is real, it is measured, it is replicated, and it is within families. It is not about who is having children. It is about what is happening to the children after they are born. And what is happening to them is what I want to talk about next. Because the IQ decline is a symptom. The cause is something much deeper and much older. It is a pattern that shows up every time a civilization reaches a certain level of complexity. And it has a name. Although the people who named it did not realize they were describing a civilizational death spiral when they did. In 1995, a marine biologist named Daniel Pauly published a paper in Trends in Ecology and Evolution that introduced a concept called shifting baseline syndrome. Pauly was studying fisheries, not civilizations. And what he noticed was this. Every generation of fisheries scientists evaluates the health of fish stocks by comparing current populations to the populations they personally remember from the beginning of their careers, not to historical baselines, not to what the stocks looked like 50 or 100 years ago, to what they looked like when that particular scientist started working. The result is that each generation of scientists accepts a more degraded ocean as normal. The baseline shifts downward with every cohort. And because no one alive remembers what the ocean used to look like, the cumulative loss becomes invisible. A fisheries scientist in 2010 might look at a depleted stock and say it is healthy, because it looks the same as it did when she started her career in 1990. But a fisheries scientist from 1950, if you could bring one back, would look at that same stock and see catastrophic decline. Same data, same ocean, completely different perception of what normal looks like. Papworth, Rist, Coad, and Milner-Gulland formalized the concept in Conservation Letters in 2009, distinguishing between two types of baseline shift: personal amnesia, where an individual forgets how things used to be within their own lifetime, and generational amnesia, where knowledge of previous conditions is simply never transmitted to the next cohort. The second type is the one that matters for civilizations, because generational amnesia means the loss is not just forgotten, it is unperceivable. You cannot miss what you never knew existed. In 2022, a legal scholar named Robin Cundis-Craig published a paper extending shifting baseline syndrome into public law. Her case study is vaccination. The generation that experienced polio firsthand understood viscerally why vaccination mattered. Their children, raised in a world where polio was already rare because of vaccination, understood it intellectually, but not experientially. Their grandchildren, raised in a world where polio essentially did not exist, began to question whether vaccination was necessary at all. They demanded exemptions, and they got the measles outbreaks of 2015 and 2019. Same medical infrastructure, same available knowledge. But a generation that had never seen the disease could not perceive the risk, because the success of the previous generation's solution had erased the problem from lived experience. And this is the mechanism that connects everything I've been telling you. Plato's generational decay, Polybius's Anacyclosis, Ibn Khaldun's three-generation cycle, Mannheim's incompatible worldviews, Giuliano and Spilimbergo's impressionable years, the Flynn effect reversal. They are all descriptions of the same underlying process. Each generation constructs its model of reality from the conditions it personally experienced during its formative years. Those conditions are the product of the previous generation's efforts, and because the efforts succeeded, the conditions that made the efforts necessary become invisible. The next generation inherits the solution, but not the memory of the problem. So they redefine the terms. They keep the word society. They keep the word works. But they mean something different. And the something different they mean is calibrated to a baseline that has already shifted. This is not a cultural complaint. This is not, kids these days don't understand how good they have it. This is a structural feature of complex societies that has been independently identified by scholars on 3 continents across 24 centuries. And if you think it sounds theoretical, I need to show you what it looks like when it plays out in real time. Because we have the data, we have the surveys, we have the numbers. And the numbers are not ambiguous. And I should tell you something about the man who figured all of this out 650 years before the survey data confirmed it, because his life is itself an illustration of the pattern he described. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunis in 1332 into a family that had been politically prominent in Muslim Spain for centuries. His ancestors had served as advisors and administrators across multiple dynasties. By the time he was born, the family had migrated to North Africa and was still connected to courts and power structures across the Maghreb. He received the finest education available in the Muslim world, studying the Quran, Hadith, jurisprudence, and Arabic grammar with some of the leading scholars of his age. He was, in every sense, a product of the elite. And then the Black Death killed both of his parents when he was 17. Think about the timing. 17 years old, right at the opening of the impressionable years window that Giuliano and Spilimbergo would identify 6 centuries later. The formative shock was not abstract. It was not a recession or a policy change. It was a plague that killed roughly 1/3 of the population of North Africa and left the young Ibn Khaldun an orphan inside a civilization that was visibly disintegrating around him. The Hafsid dynasty in Tunis was fracturing. The Marinid dynasty in Fez was unstable. Political alliances shifted constantly. Ibn Khaldun would spend the next 3 decades moving between courts, serving various rulers, being imprisoned at least once, narrowly avoiding assassination, and watching dynasty after dynasty cycle through the same stages of rise, consolidation, corruption, and collapse. By the time he retreated to the castle at Qalat ibn Salama in 1375 to write the Muqaddimah, he was not theorizing from a library. He was synthesizing decades of direct observation. He had served rulers who embodied every stage of the cycle he described. He had watched Asabiyyah erode in real time, in courts where the 3rd-generation heirs of desert warriors lounged in silk while their frontier provinces revolted. The Muqaddimah is not a work of speculation. It is a work of pattern recognition by someone who had lived inside the pattern. And the core of his insight, the thing that makes it so much more than a theory of dynastic succession, is his understanding that the cycle is not driven by bad individuals making bad choices. It is driven by the structural relationship between experience and expectation across generations. The founding generation builds the dynasty because they have Asabiyyah, forged in the shared hardship of the desert or the frontier. The 2nd generation inherits the dynasty and still remembers, through the stories and proximity of the founders, what the hardship felt like. They consolidate. They are competent administrators because they understand the fragility of what they hold. But the 3rd generation has no access to the founding experience. They grew up in palaces. Their reference point for normal is luxury, not struggle. They are not worse people. They are differently calibrated people. Their model of what the dynasty needs is constructed from a baseline that already includes everything the first generation fought to obtain, and the fourth generation does not even know what was lost. They inherit an institution that appears functional because no one alive can remember what functional used to look like when it was built by people who understood why it needed to exist. I keep returning to this because I think it is the single most important insight in the entire history of social theory. And it was produced by a man writing alone in a castle in Algeria in the 14th century. And it has been validated by every body of empirical data collected since. The cycle is not a metaphor. It is a mechanism. And the mechanism operates through exactly the same cognitive process that Mannheim would formalize 550 years later. The formative experience constructs the filter. The filter determines what information is perceived as relevant. And when the formative experience of the next generation includes the success of the previous generation's effort, the effort itself becomes invisible. The solution becomes the new baseline, and the problem it solved becomes unperceivable. Now, I said I would show you where the modern generations actually converge and diverge, and I need to do that because the data is more specific and more disturbing than the general narrative suggests. The World Values Survey has been running since 1981. 7 waves of data, nearly 100 countries. And when you map generational cohorts within a single country on Inglehart's two-dimensional value space, the pattern is consistent. Younger cohorts sit further toward the secular, rational end of the traditional versus secular rational axis, meaning they are less likely to derive their values from religion, tradition, and deference to authority. And they sit further toward the self-expression end of the survival versus self-expression axis, meaning they prioritize autonomy, creativity, quality of life, and individual freedom over economic security, physical safety, and group conformity. This is not inherently good or bad. Inglehart himself framed it as a natural consequence of growing up in material security. If you never experienced real scarcity, you do not prioritize scarcity prevention. You prioritize the things that scarcity prevention was supposed to enable: a meaningful life, authentic relationships, creative expression, personal freedom. This is entirely rational from the perspective of the cohort that experienced it. The problem is not that the values are wrong. The problem is that the values are calibrated to conditions that were created by a previous generation's priorities that the new generation does not share, and crucially, cannot share, because the conditions that would have produced those priorities no longer exist. And the places where the divergence is widest are exactly the places where the social contract is most load-bearing. Let me be specific. On same-sex marriage, the generational gap in the United States between adults over 65 and adults under 30 is consistently above 30 percentage points in support, depending on the survey and year. On immigration, the gap is 20 to 30 points. On whether traditional gender roles are preferable, the gap is often above 25 points. On whether authority figures should be obeyed without question, the gap exceeds 30 points in many Western democracies, according to World Values Survey data. On whether religion should play a role in government, the gap is over 20 points. These are not differences of degree, they are differences of kind. When one generation believes that authority figures should be obeyed because they are authority figures, and another generation believes that authority figures should be challenged because their authority is not self-justifying, those two generations are not disagreeing about a policy question. They are operating from incompatible models of how social organization works. One model says the social contract includes deference to established hierarchy. The other model says The social contract is a negotiation between autonomous individuals, and any hierarchy that cannot justify itself from first principles has no legitimate claim on obedience. Both of these models are internally coherent. Both are rational responses to the conditions their adherents grew up in, and both are simultaneously in use within the same population, governing the same institutions, applying to the same laws. The institutions were designed for one model. They are now inhabited by both, and the friction between them is not a debate that can be won. It is a structural incompatibility that will persist until one cohort dies or the institutions are rebuilt. Norris and Inglehart's cultural backlash frames the rise of authoritarian populism as the predictable response of the older, materialist cohort to this structural displacement. The populist voter is not irrational. They are responding to a real phenomenon. The social contract they grew up with has been replaced without their consent by a contract they did not agree to. Their vote for a strong man is not a failure of democratic reasoning. It is the exercise of democratic reasoning within a framework where the only option that promises to restore the lost contract is a leader willing to override the institutional norms that the newer contract depends on. And the younger cohort's response, equally predictable, is to see the populist voter as a threat to the institutions they understand as foundational. But the institutions the younger cohort is defending are not the same institutions the older cohort built. They share a name. They share a legal structure. But the operative definition of what those institutions are for has shifted so far that defending them means different things depending on which generational model you carry. The 68-year-old defends the institution because it represents stability and order. The 26-year-old defends the institution because it represents rights and inclusion. When they both say, "I support democracy," they do not mean the same sentence, and the gap between their meanings is the gap the collapse travels through. Now, I have told you about the ancient pattern, the modern measurement, the generational imprinting, the value divergence, and the trust collapse. Each of those threads is a failed attempt to answer the central question, which is whether the generational divergence in what society works means is a manageable cultural difference or a structural feature that precedes collapse. And each thread has deepened the question rather than resolving it because the data keeps pointing in the same direction. But there is a layer underneath all of this that I have been circling, and it is the layer that changes everything. Because so far, I have been talking about how generations perceive society differently. What I have not yet told you is that the actual capacity of the population to maintain the systems it depends on is changing at the same time, in the same direction, and through the same mechanism. And when you combine declining institutional trust, incompatible social contracts, and eroding baseline competency in the same population at the same time, you do not get a debate. You get a death spiral, a system that cannot agree on what it is, served by a population that trusts it less with each cohort, maintained by people whose cognitive capacity to maintain it is measurably declining in the specific domains that maintenance requires. That is not a culture war. That is a structural failure signature, and it has been documented over 200 times in Turchin's Crisis DB. Same signature, same variables, same trajectory, different centuries, different continents, same outcome. In 2023, Gallup and the Walton Family Foundation conducted the State of American Youth Survey. They surveyed 3,114 young Americans between the ages of 12 and 26. And they asked them how much they trust the major institutions of American life. The results are, and I do not use this word casually, staggering. Science is the only major institution that a majority of Generation Z trusts. 71% said they trust science a great deal, or quite a lot. That sounds reassuring until you realize what comes next. Fewer than 24% trust the criminal justice system or the Supreme Court. Fewer than 17% trust Congress. Fewer than 17% trust the news media. Fewer than 17% trust the presidency. Fewer than 17% trust large technology companies. Let those numbers sit for a moment. We are not talking about mild skepticism. We are talking about a generation where more than 83% of the population has functionally zero trust in the legislature, the executive branch, the judicial system, the press, and the technology platforms through which they receive most of their information about the world. The only institution with majority trust is science, and even that is at 71%, which means nearly a third of the youngest adult generation does not meaningfully trust the process by which we determine what is factually true. Now compare that to the oldest living generation. Gallup published their September 2025 Trust in Media at new low of 28% in US. And buried in that data is a generational breakdown that tells you everything you need to know. Among adults aged 65 and older, 43% still trust the mass media. Among millennials, 23%. Among Generation Z, 28%. That is a gap of 15 to 20 percentage points between the oldest and youngest cohorts, and it is the lowest number Gallup has recorded since they began the series in 1972. But here is what makes this more than just a depressing survey result. The gap is not a period effect. It is not that everyone's trust declined equally because of some specific event. The gap is generational. It moves with the cohort, the people who grew up in the 1950s and 60s, who came of age in a world where Walter Cronkite told you what happened, and you believed him because the system that produced Walter Cronkite had earned that trust. Those people still carry that trust. It was burned in during their impressionable years, exactly as Giuliano and Spilimbergo's model predicts. And the people who grew up in a world of social media, algorithmic feeds, deep fakes, and institutional failure after institutional failure, those people carry a fundamentally different model. Same word, trust, completely different operational definition. The older generation means something like, I believe these institutions are competent and act in good faith. The younger generation means something closer to, I assume these institutions are either incompetent or lying, and I act accordingly. Both generations would tell you they live in a society that works. Neither generation means the same thing by that sentence. Robert Putnam spent 25 years documenting where this leads. His book, Bowling Alone, published in 2000, draws on roughly 500,000 interviews conducted over a quarter century, and it tracks the collapse of what Putnam calls social capital, the network of civic associations, voluntary organizations, and informal social connections that hold a society together in ways that formal institutions cannot, and the numbers are devastating. US union membership fell from 32.5% of the non-agricultural workforce in 1953 to 15.8% by 1992. PTA participation collapsed. Rotary Club membership collapsed. Church attendance collapsed. Bowling league membership collapsed, which is where the title comes from. Americans were still bowling, but they were bowling alone. The collective infrastructure of shared civic life was disintegrating. And Putnam did something that most people who cite his book never mention. He quantified the causes. He attributed the decline roughly 50% to generational replacement, 25% to television, 10% to suburbanization and commuting, 10% to work and family pressure, with 15 to 20% unexplained. That first number is the one that matters. 50%. Half of the collapse in American social capital is not about policy or technology or economic conditions. It is about the fact that the generation that built those civic institutions, the World War II generation, what Putnam calls the long civic generation, is dying, and the generations replacing them do not join, not because they are lazy, not because they are selfish, but because the formative experience that made joining feel natural and necessary, the shared sacrifice of a depression and a world war, was never transmitted. It could not be transmitted. You cannot inherit the feeling of having survived something together. You can only inherit the institutions that the survivors built. And without the feeling, the institutions feel hollow. This is Ibn Khaldun's Asabiyyah erosion, measured with survey data in the 21st century. The third generation has completely forgotten the desert life. They have lost the taste for group feeling. Written in 1377, confirmed in 2000 with 500,000 data points. But I said this pattern has a shape, and I said the shape looks like collapse. So let me show you the shape. In 1971, a political scientist named Ronald Inglehart published a paper in the American Political Science Review, Volume 65, Issue 4, titled The Silent Revolution in Europe: Intergenerational Change in Post-Industrial Societies. The paper introduced two hypotheses that have shaped everything we know about generational value shifts. The scarcity hypothesis says that people place the highest value on whatever was scarce during their formative years. If you grew up hungry, you value economic security above everything. If you grew up safe, you value self-expression and belonging above everything. The socialization hypothesis says that this value imprinting happens during the impressionable years and does not change afterward. You carry the priorities of your youth for the rest of your life. Inglehart then did something no one had done before. He designed a survey instrument, tested it across multiple European countries, and showed that younger cohorts in post-war affluent democracies had permanently re-ranked their priorities. They valued what he called post-material goods, self-expression, quality of life, environmental protection, individual autonomy, above what he called material goods, economic growth, physical security, social order, national defense. And the shift was not temporary. It was cohort-based. As the older, materialist generations died and were replaced by younger, post-materialist generations, the entire value landscape of Western democracies was being rewritten. Inglehart went on to found the World Value Survey in 1981, which has now completed 7 waves of data collection across nearly 100 countries, with Wave 7 covering 2017 to 2022. The survey maps every country along 2 axes, traditional versus secular rational values, and survival versus self-expression values. Inglehart and his collaborator Christian Welzel claim that these 2 dimensions explain more than 70% of the cross-national variance on 10 core values indicators. 70%. 2 axes. That is an extraordinarily clean result for a social science finding, and it means that the way entire populations think about what society is for can be located on a 2-dimensional map. And here is where it gets directly relevant to the question we have been building toward. When you overlay generational cohort data on the Inglehart-Welzel map, the youngest cohorts in advanced democracies sit dramatically further toward the self-expression end of the axis than the oldest cohorts in the same country. The gap is not subtle. It is 20 to 40 percentage points on core values questions like whether self-expression is more important than physical security, whether individual autonomy is more important than social conformity, where the tolerance of difference is more important than traditional moral codes. Two cohorts in the same country, using the same language, living under the same laws, who are not just disagreeing about policy. They are operating from incompatible definitions of what society is supposed to provide. Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart documented the political consequences of this gap in their 2019 book, Cultural Backlash, Trump, Brexit, and Authoritarian Populism, published by Cambridge University Press. Their argument is precise and data-driven. The rise of authoritarian populism across Western democracies is not random. It is not about charismatic leaders. It is a structural reaction by older, less educated, more religious cohorts to the fact that the post-materialist majority has been quietly rewriting the social contract on gender, sexuality, immigration, and religious authority for 4 decades without asking them. The social contract they grew up with, the one where traditional gender roles were normal, where national identity was defined by ethnic and religious continuity, where authority was respected because it was authority. That contract has been replaced, and no one held a referendum. No one asked permission. The replacement happened generationally, one cohort at a time, through the mechanism Inglehart identified in 1971. And the widest generational gaps, the places where the two cohorts' definitions diverge most violently, are on precisely the questions where the social contract is being rewritten. Same-sex marriage, gender roles, immigration, deference to authority. These are not peripheral issues. These are the load-bearing walls of a shared definition of society works, and they are being defined in opposite directions by people who share a country. Generational cohort is one of the strongest predictors of authoritarian populist voting. Norris and Inglehart document that the average vote share of populist parties across European parliamentary elections more than doubled between the 1960s and the 2010s, and their seat share tripled. The older, more traditional cohort is not just losing the argument, they are losing the definition of what the argument is about. And their response, predictably, is to reach for the strong man, to demand the restoration of a social contract that no longer exists in the minds of the people who would have to live under it. Plato described this exact sequence 2,400 years ago. The children of the democrats, raised in total freedom, become so accustomed to liberty that they cannot tolerate any authority. Society fragments. Faction fights faction, and the people, exhausted by chaos, hand power to a tyrant. Polybius described it. Ibn Khaldun described it. And now we have the survey data. The World Values Survey, the General Social Survey, Gallup, Pew, all telling the same story in different vocabulary. But I need to show you something else now, because everything I have described so far, the generational perception gap, the impressionable years imprinting, the value divergence, the social capital collapse, all of that could theoretically be manageable. Societies can survive disagreement. They can survive value shifts. What they cannot survive is what happens when the disagreement is layered on top of a simultaneous decline in the actual capacity to maintain the systems that everyone depends on. And that decline is not hypothetical. It has been measured, it has historical precedent, and the precedent is terrifying. I already told you about the Flynn effect reversal. IQ scores declining within families in Norway since the mid-1970s. But that is a modern data point in a pattern that is much older and much more dramatic. Because when a civilization's competency actually collapses, it does not look like a gentle slope on a graph. It looks like a cliff, and the people living through it rarely recognize it as happening because of the same shifting baseline syndrome that makes each generation accept its degraded condition as normal. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean experienced what historians now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. In the span of roughly 50 years, every major palace civilization in the region fell. The Mycenaeans, the Hittites, the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, the city-state of Ugarit, the Kassites of Babylon. Populations in some regions dropped by 50 to 75%. Trade networks that had connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, to the Aegean, disintegrated. And literacy, specifically the Linear B writing system used across the Mycenaean world, vanished entirely. It did not evolve into something else. It simply stopped being used, and it was not recovered for 300 to 400 years. Think about what that means. An entire civilization, one capable of building the palace at Knossos and the citadel at Mycenae, lost the ability to write, not because an enemy burned their libraries, not because a natural disaster destroyed their schools, but because the chain of transmission broke. The people who knew how to read and write did not successfully pass that knowledge to the people who came after them, and within 2 generations, it was gone. And this is not a one-time event. The pattern repeats. Procopius of Caesarea, writing in the 6th century CE, is one of the most important historical sources for the late Roman Empire. And there is a passage in his work on buildings, written around 555, that I think about constantly. Procopius is describing the great construction projects of the Emperor Justinian, and he comes to Trajan's bridge across the Danube, which had been built 400 years earlier by the architect Apollodorus of Damascus. And Procopius cannot describe how the bridge was built, not because the records were lost, but because no one in his era understood the engineering well enough to explain it. So he simply defers to the original architect's account. He writes, and I am paraphrasing the translation, "How he built this bridge I shall not be at pains to relate, but shall let Apollodorus of Damascus, who was the master builder of the whole work, describe the operation." A historian of the Roman Empire, writing within the borders of the Roman Empire about a bridge built by Roman engineers, has to cite a 400-year-old source because the knowledge of how to build it no longer exists in his civilization. The bridge was still standing. The people who could build it were gone. And in his Wars, Book 5, Procopius describes Belisarius' siege of Naples in 537, where Roman soldiers needed to enter the city through the old aqueduct. But the aqueduct, only a few centuries old, had deteriorated to the point where soldiers could barely squeeze through, because no living engineer knew how to maintain or repair it. They had to scrape their way through with hand files. The infrastructure was still there. The competency to operate it had evaporated. The loss of Roman concrete is another case that is often oversimplified, but is worth getting right. The Romans used a specific recipe involving volcanic pozzolanic ash that allowed concrete to set underwater and to actually strengthen over time through a chemical reaction with seawater. Medieval builders used concrete of various kinds, so it was not entirely lost. But the specific Roman hydraulic recipe was effectively unavailable for roughly 1300 years, until John Smeaton's experiments with the Eddystone Lighthouse in the 1750s and Joseph Aspadine's Portland cement patent in 1824. 1300 years, 50 generations, each one presumably assuming that their concrete was normal because they had no experiential memory of anything better. And then there is the Ming case, which I opened with, and which is the most chilling of all, because it was not accidental. Louis Dacier did not lose the navigation archives. He destroyed them. Zheng He's treasure fleets had represented the pinnacle of Ming naval technology. Ships that may have been over 400 feet long, although the exact dimensions are debated. fleets of 300 vessels carrying 28,000 crew, 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433 that reached Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. But the Confucian literati who came to dominate the court after the Yongle Emperor's death viewed the voyages as wasteful, immoral, and dangerously cosmopolitan. They represented a worldview that the next generation of elites had decided was wrong. So they destroyed the evidence. And then they banned the capability. By 1525, building a ship with more than 2 masts was a criminal offense. Within a century, the Ming Navy was a coastal defense force with vessels a quarter the size of Zheng He's flagships. The generation that inherited the world's most advanced naval fleet did not just fail to maintain it, they actively dismantled it. Because their definition of what society needed, their generational model of how the world works, did not include the ocean. Joseph Needham and John Fairbank argued this was deliberate ideological suppression by a faction that wanted to turn China's attention inward. Jack Goldstone has argued it was a defensible fiscal choice in the context of northern border threats. The debate about motivation is interesting, but for our purposes, the outcome is what matters. One generation's greatest technological achievement became the next generation's deliberate rejection, and within 2 generations, the competency itself was gone. Not because it was too difficult, but because it was defined out of relevance by a generation whose model of society did not include it. I want to stay with the competency question for a moment longer, because there is a dimension of it that does not get discussed and that I think is the most important dimension of all. And that is the distinction between tool competency and systemic competency. Every generation becomes expert at using the tools of its era. Baby boomers became expert at operating within hierarchical organizations, managing paper-based information systems, and navigating a world of telephone calls and face-to-face meetings. Generation X became expert at early digital tools, desktop computing, email, and the transition from analog to digital information management. Millennials became expert at social media, smartphones, and information navigation in a connected world. Generation Z is becoming expert at algorithmic information consumption, AI-mediated workflows, and digital native communication. Each of these is a genuine competency. Each generation would rightly say it is more capable than the previous generation at handling the specific informational environment it inhabits. A 22-year-old can navigate TikTok, Instagram, Discord, and ChatGPT with an ease that a 60-year-old cannot match. This is real. This is not in dispute. But tool competency and systemic competency are different things. Tool competency is the ability to use the instruments of your era. Systemic competency is the ability to understand the systems those instruments operate within. And the two have been diverging for at least 50 years. A 22-year-old who can flawlessly navigate GPS to any location may have no functional ability to read a topographic map. A 30-year-old who can find any fact on Google within seconds may have no functional ability to evaluate whether the source of that fact is credible without Google's ranking algorithm making the judgment for them. A 40-year-old who can use Excel to model a financial scenario may have no functional ability to perform the same calculation by hand, and therefore no ability to recognize when the spreadsheet produces an error. None of these are moral failures. They are rational adaptations. If the tool is always available, the skill it replaces atrophies because maintaining unused skills is metabolically expensive and cognitively inefficient. The brain is an optimization engine. It prunes what it does not use. This is well-established neuroscience. The Damani and Bobot GPS study is simply the most recent and most direct measurement of this process. But the implication for systemic competency is profound, because the systems that maintain modern civilization, the electrical grid, the water treatment infrastructure, the global logistics chains, the financial system, the internet itself, were designed and built by people who understood them from the ground up. The engineers who designed the power grid understood thermodynamics. The programmers who built the early internet understood packet switching at the protocol level. The architects of the financial system understood the mathematics of risk pricing. Each subsequent generation inherits these systems as black boxes. You do not need to understand how TCP/IP works to use the internet. You do not need to understand how water treatment works to turn on a faucet. You do not need to understand how the financial system prices risk to take out a mortgage. And so with each generation, the number of people who actually understand how the load-bearing systems work decreases, while the number of people who depend on those systems increases. The ratio of system understanders to system users shifts steadily in one direction. And this is not unique to the modern era. It is the exact pattern that produced the Roman concrete problem. The people who knew how to make the concrete died. The people who depended on the concrete continued to depend on it. When it cracked, no one knew how to repair it. The knowledge was not in a book that had been burned. It was in the hands and minds of craftspeople who had trained the next generation, who had trained the next, until at some point the chain broke and the knowledge was gone. The buildings were still standing. The formula was gone. The modern version of this is playing out in real time, and it is being accelerated by the same technological outsourcing that produces the Flynn effect reversal. Every time a cognitive function is offloaded to a tool, two things happen simultaneously. The task still gets done, so the system appears to function normally, and the human capacity to do that task without the tool atrophies, so the system's resilience decreases. The system looks stable. Its fragility increases. And because the fragility is invisible, because the system keeps producing outputs, nobody notices until the tool fails. And this connects back to the generational baseline shift in a way that I think is the most unsettling thread in this entire story. Because each generation evaluates the system's health against its own baseline. A generation that grew up with GPS evaluates navigation competency against GPS-enabled performance. A generation that grew up with AI evaluates reasoning competency against AI-augmented performance. The system appears healthy because the outputs are maintained, but the outputs are being maintained by the tools, not by the people. And if you remove the tools, the human performance underneath has degraded in a way that no living generation perceives, because no living generation remembers what human-only performance looked like. This is Daniel Pauly's shifting baseline syndrome applied to the cognitive infrastructure of civilization itself. The fisheries scientist cannot see the decline because she calibrated to the depleted ocean she first studied. The modern knowledge worker cannot see the cognitive decline because she calibrated to the AI-augmented workplace she first entered. Both are competent by their own measures. Both are operating at a fraction of the capacity of their predecessors by any absolute measure, and neither can perceive the gap, because perceiving it would require access to a baseline that no longer exists in lived experience. I said earlier that Postman wrote, "What we need is not more information, but a new way of thinking." And I think the cruelest irony of the pattern I have been describing is that each generation does develop a new way of thinking. It just develops the new way automatically, during the impressionable years calibrated to whatever environment happens to exist at the time. The new way of thinking is not chosen. It is imposed by circumstance, and it is precisely as adequate as the circumstances that produced it, and precisely as inadequate for any circumstances that differ from those. The boomers' way of thinking was forged in post-war stability and is inadequate for a world of algorithmic information warfare. The millennials' way of thinking was forged in the 2008 financial crisis and is inadequate for a world where the institutional structures they distrust are the same structures they would need to rebuild. Generation Z's way of thinking is being forged right now in a world of AI and institutional collapse and climate anxiety, and will be precisely adequate for that world and precisely inadequate for whatever comes next. No generation gets the way of thinking it needs. Every generation gets the way of thinking its formative conditions impose, and the gap between what is imposed and what is needed is the gap that the pattern exploits over and over across centuries, across civilizations, with the mathematical regularity of a physical law. Ibn Khaldun gave it 120 years. The current institutional order dates from roughly 1945. Do the arithmetic, and I know what you might be thinking. That was the past. We are different now. We have the internet, we have digital archives, we have redundant storage systems and cloud backups, and the Library of Congress. The knowledge cannot be lost the way it was lost in the Bronze Age, or in Ming China, or in post-Roman Europe. But you are confusing knowledge with competency, and they are not the same thing. The knowledge of how to navigate by the stars still exists. It is in textbooks. It is on Wikipedia. But the competency, the actual ability to look at the night sky and know where you are, has largely disappeared from the general population. The knowledge of how to do mental arithmetic still exists, but the competency has atrophied in any population with constant access to calculators. The knowledge of how to find your way through an unfamiliar city still exists, but the competency is being actively degraded by the tool we use most. In 2020, Louisa Damani and Veronique Bobot published a study in Scientific Reports, Volume 10, Article 6310, that should be required reading for anyone who uses a GPS. They tracked 50 regular drivers and retested 13 of them 3 years later, and they found that habitual GPS use was associated with steeper declines in hippocampal-dependent spatial memory over time. The more you use GPS, the worse your spatial memory gets, and the direction of causation runs from GPS use to memory decline, not the other way around. It is not that people with bad spatial memory use GPS more. It is that using GPS makes your spatial memory worse. This matters because of earlier research by Eleanor Maguire at University College London, published in 2000, which showed that London taxi drivers who had completed the knowledge, the grueling memorization of 25,000 streets and thousands of landmarks required to get a London taxi license, had measurably larger hippocampi than the general population. The brain region responsible for spatial navigation physically grows when it is exercised through active navigation. And the inverse experiment, the one where you stop exercising it by outsourcing navigation to a machine, produces the inverse result. The brain region shrinks. The competency atrophies, not metaphorically, physically. Now multiply this across every cognitive domain that has been outsourced to technology over the past 40 years. Mental arithmetic to calculators, spelling to autocorrect, memory to search engines, navigation to GPS. And now, since 2022, abstract reasoning and critical thinking to generative artificial intelligence. In February 2025, a team led by Tobias Lee at Microsoft Research and Carnegie Mellon University published a paper titled "The Impact of Generative AI on Critical Thinking." self-reported reductions in cognitive effort and confidence effects from a survey of knowledge workers. They surveyed 319 knowledge workers across 936 self-reported AI-assisted tasks. And the finding was stark. On 40% of tasks performed with AI assistance, the workers reported applying no critical thinking whatsoever. Zero, not reduced critical thinking. No critical thinking, and the more confident they were in the AI's output, the less critical thinking they applied. Trust in the tool and cognitive engagement moved in opposite directions. I need to be careful with this data because it is self-reported and the sample size is moderate. But the direction is consistent with everything else. Damani and Bobot showed it in spatial memory. Maguire showed the inverse in London taxi drivers. The Microsoft study shows it in abstract reasoning. The pattern is the same. When you outsource a cognitive function to a tool, the neural circuitry that performs that function atrophies. Not instantly, not dramatically, but measurably, generationally. And here is where the concept locks together with everything I have been building. Because when Daniel Pauly described shifting baseline syndrome in fisheries, he was describing the inability of each generation of scientists to perceive cumulative ecological loss, because each generation calibrates to the degraded ocean it personally experienced. But the same mechanism operates on competency. Each generation calibrates its definition of competent to whatever it can personally do with the tools available to it. A generation that grew up with GPS defines competent navigation as the ability to follow a blue dot on a screen. A generation that grew up with search engines defines competent knowledge retrieval as the ability to type a question into Google. A generation growing up with AI may define competent reasoning as the ability to evaluate and edit AI-generated output. None of these generations would describe themselves as less competent than the one before. Each one would say, accurately from their own baseline, that they are perfectly capable of doing what needs to be done. And they would be right, as long as the tools keep working. The competency has not disappeared. It is being redistributed from the human brain to the technological infrastructure. The person still gets from A to B. The person still finds the answer. The person still produces the report. But the load-bearing cognitive work has shifted from the biological system to the mechanical one. And if the mechanical system falters, the biological system no longer has the capacity it once did to pick up the slack. Neil Postman saw this coming in 1985, almost 4 decades before the AI explosion. In Amusing Ourselves to Death, he drew a distinction between George Orwell's dystopia and Aldous Huxley's dystopia that has become one of the most cited passages in media criticism. Orwell feared that we would be destroyed by what we hate. Huxley feared that we would be destroyed by what we love. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. And Postman's verdict was that Huxley was the more prescient prophet. We are not censored into ignorance. We are entertained into it. We are not deprived of information. We are overwhelmed by it to the point where no single piece of information seems more important than any other. And Postman wrote something else that connects directly to the generational divergence we have been tracking. He wrote, "What we need is not more information, but a new way of thinking." And here is the brutal irony. Each generation has a way of thinking. It was formed during their impressionable years. It cannot be overwritten, and it was designed, if that is even the right word, to navigate the specific informational environment that existed when they were 18 to 25. The baby boomers' way of thinking was calibrated to a world of 3 TV networks and a daily newspaper. Generation X was calibrated to early cable and the beginning of the internet. Millennials were calibrated to social media and the smartphone. Generation Z was calibrated to algorithmic feeds and, increasingly, AI-mediated information. Each one has a way of thinking. None of them has the same way. And the environment that each way of thinking was designed for no longer exists, because the next generation's tools have already changed it. So, you have a population where each cohort was neurologically imprinted with a different model of reality. During a developmental window that closes in the mid-20s, you have measurable divergences in what they trust, what they value, what they mean by society works, and what they consider competent behavior. You have measurable declines in baseline cognitive capacity across several dimensions in multiple developed countries. You have each generation accepting its degraded baseline as normal because the previous generation's capacity has been shifted out of lived experience. And you have all of this happening simultaneously, layered on top of each other, in a population that shares a government, an economy, and a set of institutions that were designed by a generation whose worldview is now shared by a shrinking minority. That is the structural picture, and it is bad enough on its own, but it is not the scariest part. The scariest part is that this picture has been seen before. It has been modeled. The models make predictions, and the predictions have a track record. In 2010, a complexity scientist named Peter Turchin published a commentary in the journal Nature, volume 463, page 608, in which he made a specific, dated prediction. He said that the United States would experience a peak in political instability around 2020. He did not say this based on political intuition or partisan analysis. He said it based on a mathematical model called structural demographic theory, which he had developed over the previous decade by applying quantitative methods to historical data on civilizational crises. The model has three variables: popular immiseration, meaning the decline in real wages relative to GDP per capita, the gap between what the economy produces and what the average person actually gets. Elite overproduction, meaning the creation of more aspiring elites than the system can absorb. More people with degrees and credentials and ambitions competing for a fixed or shrinking number of positions that match those ambitions. And state fiscal distress, meaning the erosion of the government's ability to fund its operations and maintain its legitimacy. Turchin did not invent these variables. They come from the work of Jack Goldstone, a sociologist at George Mason University who published Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World in 1991. Goldstone studied four early modern crises: the English Civil War of the 1640s, the French Revolution of 1789, the Ottoman crisis of the 17th century, and the Ming Dynasty collapse of the 17th century, and he developed a political stress indicator, abbreviated as the Greek letter psi, that combines the three variables into a single composite measure. Goldstone showed that in every one of those four cases, the PSI rose 3 to 5 times above its stable period baseline before the system broke. 3 to 5 times. That is the danger threshold. Turchin took Goldstone's framework, mathematized it further, and applied it to the United States over the past 250 years. He published the full treatment in Ages of Discord in 2016, but the Nature prediction came 6 years earlier, in 2010. He looked at the trajectory of the three variables: popular immiseration, elite overproduction, state fiscal distress, and the model said they were all rising. They have been rising since roughly the late 1970s, and their combined trajectory pointed to a peak in political instability around 2020. He published this in Nature in 2010, before the Tea Party, before Occupy Wall Street, before Charlottesville, before the 2020 protests, before January 6th, before the general sense of institutional disintegration that now pervades American public life. The model said 2020. And if you look at what actually happened in 2020, and in the years immediately surrounding it, the model was correct. I want to be precise about what correct means here, because Turchin's work has been criticized, and some of those criticisms are legitimate. Scott Alexander and others have pointed out that some of Turchin's proxy measures, like using the number of medical residency slots as an indicator of elite overproduction, are arguably misinterpreted. The model fits historical data well, but fitting historical data is easier than predicting the future, and there is always a risk of overfitting. These are fair methodological concerns, but the specific prediction published in Nature in 2010 was not post hoc. It was not adjusted after the fact. It named a date, and the date was right. And the specific variables he identified as driving the instability, declining real wages relative to productivity, an explosion in the number of people competing for elite positions, and growing government fiscal strain, are all empirically documented and ongoing. The elite overproduction variable deserves special attention because it connects directly to the generational story. Turchin tracked the number of US lawyers per capita, which increased approximately fourfold between 1970 and 2010. He tracked the number of PhDs awarded annually, which roughly tripled over the same period, while the number of tenure-track academic positions remained essentially flat. He tracked the inflation-adjusted cost of winning a US Senate seat, which grew by several multiples relative to median household income. All of these are measures of the same thing: more people trained and credentialed for elite positions than the system has room for. And here is what that looks like from the inside of a generational cohort. You are a millennial. You were told by your parents, the boomers, who were told by their parents, the greatest generation, that education is the path to success. So you went to college, you went to graduate school, you accumulated credentials and debt, and then you entered a labor market that had been structurally reconfigured while you were in school. The positions that your credentials were supposed to unlock either do not exist in sufficient numbers, or they pay a fraction of what they paid for the previous generation. But the debt is real. The expectations are real. The gap between where you thought you would be and where you are is not a feeling. It is a measurable quantity. And Turchin's model says that this gap, aggregated across an entire cohort of frustrated elites, is one of the three conditions that precedes civilizational crisis. Every single time. Goldstone demonstrated this across 4 early modern cases. Turchin built a database called CrisisDB, containing over 200 historical crises. In 3/4 of those cases, the breakdown ended in revolution, civil war, or both. In 60% of the polities studied, the political entity that existed before the crisis simply ceased to exist. It was not reformed, it was not improved, it was replaced. And in 2017, Ortmans, Mazzeo, Mescherina, and Korotayev applied Turchin's structural demographic framework to the United Kingdom in a paper published in Cliodynamics, Volume 8, Issue 2. They found that the UK's political stress indicator rose sharply from 2009 to 2016, coincident with the austerity era and the Brexit referendum. In 2002-03, Orlandi, Hoyer, Zhao, Bennett, Benham, Cohn, and Turchin published a structural demographic analysis of the Qing dynasty collapse in +1, covering the period from 1644 to 1912. They found that the Qing population grew approximately fourfold while the number of elite positions stagnated, producing exactly the elite overproduction pressure that the model predicts precedes crisis. And in every one of these cases, across centuries and continents, the crisis is not experienced by a unified population making rational decisions about how to respond. The crisis is experienced by a population fractured into generational cohorts that cannot agree on what the crisis is, much less how to solve it. The older cohort sees the crisis as a failure of discipline. The younger cohort sees it as a failure of the system they inherited. Both are partially right. Neither can see the full picture, and the full picture is that they are both actors in a pattern that has been repeating for as long as complex societies have existed. I told you at the beginning that 3 independent models converge on the same window. Turchin's structural demographic theory, built from quantitative historical analysis, pointed to 2020. Strauss and Howe's generational theory, built from a cyclical model of recurring archetypes across 4 turnings of roughly 20 years each, pointed to the late 2000s and early 2020s as a crisis era, what they call the 4th turning. And Ibn Khaldun's 3 to 4 generation cycle of Asabiyyah erosion, if you start counting from the post-World War II settlement that founded the current institutional order, gives you roughly 2020 to 2040. 3 models, 3 completely different disciplines, 3 different centuries. The same answer. Now I need to be honest about Strauss-Howe, because there is legitimate controversy there. William Strauss and Neil Howe published The 4th Turning in 1997, and it maps an 80 to 100 year cycle called the saeculum, divided into 4 turnings: high, awakening, unraveling, crisis. Each turning is populated by a generational archetype: hero, artist, prophet, nomad. The framework is evocative, and its prediction that the late 2010s would be a crisis era has aged well, but it has been called pseudo-scientific by multiple critics. Big Think described it as an elaborate historical horoscope. Jean Twenge, one of the most prominent living generational researchers, rejected the cyclical claim entirely in her 2023 book Generations, and the framework has never passed rigorous peer review the way Turchin's structural demographic model has. So I am not asking you to believe in the Strauss-Howe saeculum. I am asking you to notice that a non-quantitative cyclical model built from historical analogy, a quantitative mathematical model built from demographic and economic data, and a 14th century theory of social cohesion all point to the same window. The convergence does not prove any of them individually, but it means that the pattern they are all trying to describe is real. Something is there. Multiple instruments are detecting it, and the something has a generational signature. And this is where I need to bring in one more finding, because there is an institution that spent decades becoming the most prominent generator of generational research in the world. And in 2023, that institution publicly backed away from its own framework. In May 2023, the Pew Research Center, which had built much of the modern generational research industry, published a statement announcing that it would no longer default to generational categories in its research. They cited concerns that generational labels, Gen Z, Millennial, Boomer, create stereotypes, oversimplify complex cohort effects, and conflate generation, period, and life cycle effects. This is methodologically reasonable. The distinctions between things that happen to everyone at the same time and things that are specific to a particular cohort, and things that change as people age, regardless of when they were born, are genuinely difficult to disentangle. But the timing is remarkable. The institution that spent 30 years publishing reports with titles like Millennials Are the Most and How Gen Z Differs From, decided to step back from the framework right at the moment when the generational divergence data became impossible to ignore. Right when the trust numbers hit historic lows, right when the value divergence reached its widest measured point, right when the model started predicting that the consequences were imminent. I am not suggesting conspiracy. I am suggesting institutional discomfort. The same institutional discomfort that made the Confucian literati burn Zheng He's archives. The same institutional discomfort that made the physics establishment ignore John Bell for decades. The same mechanism that shows up every time an institution's own findings produce conclusions that threaten its operational framework. The response is not suppression, it is retreat. These categories are too simplistic. The methodology has limitations. Further research is needed. All true. All beside the point, because the pattern the categories we're detecting does not care whether the categories are methodologically clean. The pattern exists. The surveys measured it, and walking away from the measurement does not make the thing being measured go away. I need to take a detour here that is not actually a detour, because it connects to something I have been hinting at since the beginning, and that I think most people have sensed intuitively but have never seen stated explicitly with the data behind it. There is a concept in sociology that goes back to Emil Durkheim, writing in the 1890s, that I think illuminates something critical about the current moment. Durkheim distinguished between two types of social solidarity. Mechanical solidarity is the bond that holds together small, homogeneous groups where everyone shares the same beliefs, the same values, the same understanding of what life is about. You are bonded to your community because you are the same as your community. This is the solidarity of the village, the tribe, the clan. It is the solidarity of shared hardship. Organic solidarity is the bond that holds together large, complex, differentiated societies where people do not share the same beliefs or values, but are bound together by functional interdependence. You are bonded to your community, not because you are the same, but because you need each other. The surgeon needs the farmer needs the engineer needs the teacher. Nobody shares a worldview, but everybody shares a supply chain. This is the solidarity of the modern nation-state. And here is Durkheim's insight, which I think is the most underrated observation in the history of social theory. Organic solidarity is not a natural state. It is an achievement. It requires institutions that mediate between people who do not understand each other and do not share the same values but must cooperate to survive. Courts, contracts, professional standards, shared civic identity, a common educational framework, a media ecosystem that provides a baseline of shared facts. These institutions are the connective tissue of organic solidarity. Without them, a complex differentiated society has no mechanism for coordination. And without coordination, it is not a society, it is a collection of factions sharing geography. The generational divergence data I have been walking you through is, in Durkheim's framework, a systematic dismantling of the connective tissue, because the institutions that mediate organic solidarity only work if the people they serve share a roughly common understanding of what those institutions are for. And the World Values Survey data shows that they do not. The Gallup data shows that they do not trust those institutions regardless. And the Putnam data shows that the informal social networks that once supplemented institutional mediation, the Rotary clubs and bowling leagues and church groups and union halls, have collapsed by roughly 50%, driven primarily by generational replacement. So the mechanical solidarity is gone because modern societies are too complex and too differentiated for shared values to hold them together. And the organic solidarity is failing because the institutions that were supposed to substitute for shared values are not trusted. not shared in their definition, and not maintained by a population with the systemic competency to understand how they work. This is not a political problem. You cannot vote your way out of a generational baseline shift. This is not an economic problem. Redistribution does not change the cognitive filter that was burned in during the impressionable years. This is not a cultural problem. You cannot convince a 22-year-old to adopt the worldview of a 68-year-old any more than you can convince the 68-year-old to adopt the worldview of the 22-year-old. The imprinting is permanent. The models are incompatible. And the institutions that were designed to hold the incompatibility together are being eroded from both sides simultaneously. Peter Turchin understood this, and his personal trajectory is itself a kind of parable about institutional reception of uncomfortable findings. Turchin started his career as an ecologist, studying population dynamics in insects. He published the mathematical foundations of predator-prey cycles in pine beetle populations. And then he made a lateral move that no one expected. He took the same quantitative tools, the same mathematical frameworks for modeling population cycles, and applied them to human societies. He called the resulting field Cliodynamics, from Clio, the muse of history. The academic establishment's response was roughly what you would expect if you have been paying attention to the pattern of institutional resistance that runs through this entire story. The initial reaction was dismissal. History is not a science. You cannot model human behavior the way you model beetles. The variables are too complex. The data is too noisy. These are the same objections that were raised against every attempt to apply quantitative methods to a domain that preferred qualitative analysis. And they are not entirely wrong. History is more complex than ecology, but more complex does not mean not modelable. It means the models need more variables and larger data sets. And Turchin built both. Ages of Discord, published in 2016, is a book that almost nobody outside of academic cliodynamics has read, and that almost everybody should have read. It applies structural demographic theory to the United States from 1780 to the present, and shows that the current period matches the structural profile of every historical pre-crisis period in the dataset. The specific indicators Turchin tracks are not vague, they are measurable. Real wages relative to GDP per capita have been decoupling since the late 1970s, meaning the economy keeps growing, but the average person's purchasing power does not grow with it. The number of elite aspirants, people with advanced degrees, law licenses, MBAs, and political ambitions has been growing faster than the number of elite positions for 5 decades. Government debt relative to GDP has been climbing steadily, straining the state's ability to fund the services that maintain popular legitimacy. Each of these variables on its own is a source of social stress. Together, they produce what Goldstone's model calls a political stress indicator that exceeds the danger threshold. Turchin calculated that the US PSI in 2020 sat roughly an order of magnitude above its 1950s trough. An order of magnitude. That is not a gradual drift. That is a structural shift. And the generational dimension of the PSI is critical, because the 3 variables do not affect all generations equally. Popular immiseration hits younger cohorts hardest, because they entered the labor market after the decoupling of wages from productivity was already established. They have never lived in the world where hard work reliably translated to economic advancement. Elite overproduction hits younger cohorts hardest, because they were the ones who accumulated the degrees and the debt in response to the previous generation's advice, and they are the ones competing for positions that do not exist in sufficient numbers. And state fiscal distress affects all cohorts, but it is perceived differently by each one, because each one has a different model of what the state is supposed to provide and a different threshold for when fiscal strain becomes a legitimacy crisis. So the PSI is not just a national aggregate, it is a generational pressure cooker. And the pressure is not distributed evenly. It is concentrated in exactly the cohorts whose trust in institutions is lowest, whose values are most divergent from the institutional framework, and whose cognitive baseline has been most affected by technological outsourcing. The cohorts most stressed by the structural variables are the same cohorts least equipped by their generational formation to engage with the institutional mechanisms that would be required to address those variables. This is the death spiral I mentioned earlier, and I want to be very clear about what I mean by that term, because I do not mean it casually or hyperbolically. A death spiral in systems theory is a positive feedback loop where the output of a process reinforces the conditions that drive it. The institutional trust collapse makes it harder for institutions to address the structural variables. The failure to address the structural variables further erodes institutional trust. Each generation's formative experience includes the failure of the previous generation's institutions, which calibrates the new generation's baseline to include institutional failure as normal, which produces even lower trust, which produces even less institutional capacity, which produces even worse outcomes for the next cohort's formative experience. The spiral does not require conspiracy. It does not require malice. It does not require stupidity. It only requires the mechanism that every scholar I have cited has independently identified. The formative experience constructs the filter. The filter determines what is perceived as relevant, and the filter cannot be updated because the window during which it was constructed has closed. The spiral is self-sustaining. Each cohort does what makes sense from inside its own model, and the aggregate effect of every cohort doing what makes sense from inside its own model is that the system they all depend on loses coherence in a way that no single cohort can perceive, because perceiving it would require stepping outside the model. And you cannot step outside a model that was burned into your brain before you were 25. I still do not fully know how to think about this. I have spent months reading these papers, and I am not sure I have a framework that contains the full picture. But I think that is honest, and I think honesty is what this topic requires. Because the temptation, the enormous gravitational temptation, is to resolve the discomfort by picking a side, by saying that the older generation is right and the younger generation needs to toughen up, or by saying that the younger generation is right and the older generation needs to adapt. Both of those are comfortable. Both of those are wrong. Both of those are the kind of resolution that the pattern itself produces, because taking a side is what your generational model tells you to do, and taking a side is what prevents you from seeing the structural mechanism that operates underneath all sides simultaneously. The mechanism does not care which side you're on. It operates through the disagreement itself. It operates through the very act of each generation defending its model against all other models, because that defense prevents the cross-generational coordination that would be required to see the trajectory that connects Plato to Polybius, to Ibn Khaldun, to Mannheim, to Turchin, and that terminates in a destination that has been reached over 200 times in recorded history. And there is one more piece of the puzzle that I have been saving, because it arrives right at the point where the discomfort becomes unbearable. And I think that is where it belongs. Remember that I told you about the Strauss-Howe generational model, and that I was honest about its academic limitations. The model is evocative, not rigorous. It has been called an elaborate historical horoscope. It has not survived peer review the way Turchin's work has. All of that is true. But there is one aspect of the Strauss-Howe framework that maps onto something the other models confirm, and it is the aspect that deserves the most attention. Strauss and Howe argued that the cycle consists of 4 turnings, each about 20 years long, adding up to a seculum of roughly 80 to 100 years. The first turning is a high, a period of strong institutions and weak individualism, when a new civic order has just been established in the aftermath of the previous crisis. The second turning is an awakening, when the institutions built during the high are attacked by a younger generation that values personal and spiritual autonomy over institutional conformity. The third turning is an unraveling, when institutions are weak and distrusted while individualism is strong, and society fragments into competing factions that cannot agree on common purpose. The fourth turning is a crisis, when a catalyzing event or accumulating pressure forces a resolution, usually through upheaval, and a new civic order is either built or the old one collapses permanently. The saeculum that began with the end of World War II, by this reckoning, entered its fourth turning sometime in the mid-2010s. The high was the late 40s through the early 60s. The awakening was the late 60s through the early 80s. The unraveling was the mid-80s through the mid-2010s. And the crisis is now. You do not need to believe in the Strauss-Howe archetype system to notice that this timeline matches. The high corresponds to the period of maximum institutional trust, maximum social capital, maximum civic participation, all documented by Putnam and Gallup. The awakening corresponds to the initial generational value rupture, documented by Inglehart. The unraveling corresponds to the accelerating divergence documented by the World Value Survey and to the onset of the Flynn effect reversal. And the crisis corresponds to Turchin's predicted window. 3 models, 3 different methodologies, one from historical analogy, one from mathematical modeling of demographic and economic variables, one from a 14th century theory of social cohesion calibrated against medieval dynasties. They disagree about almost everything. They agree about the window. And the reason that matters, the reason I have spent this entire script building toward this, is that the pattern does not announce itself. The people living inside it do not experience it as a pattern. They experience it as normality. Each generation experiences its own formative conditions as the way things are. The 68-year-old experiences the current institutional crisis as a departure from normalcy. The 26-year-old experiences it as normalcy itself, and neither is wrong. The 68-year-old is correct that things were different when he was young. The 26-year-old is correct that the world she inhabits is the only world that has ever existed in her experience. The pattern is invisible from the inside because visibility would require comparing your current conditions to a baseline that predates your birth. It would require holding in your mind simultaneously the model of reality you were imprinted with during your impressionable years and the models held by people whose impressionable years occurred in fundamentally different conditions. And the human brain does not do this naturally. It was not designed to do this. It was designed to construct a model of the world from available data between the ages of 15 and 25, and then defend that model for the remaining 60 years of life. The model is adaptive during the window. After the window closes, it is fixed, not because the brain is broken, because fixing the model was adaptive in the environment where the brain evolved, an environment where conditions changed slowly enough that a model built in youth was adequate for a lifetime. The modern environment changes too fast for this to work. The conditions that existed during a person's impressionable years no longer exist by the time that person reaches a position of institutional authority. roughly 20 to 30 years later. And the person making institutional decisions at 55 is applying a model that was calibrated to the world of 30 years ago. This is not a personal failure. This is a design constraint of human cognition applied to an environment that violates its assumptions. And this is why the Ottoman diagnosis without action is not an anomaly. It is the default. Khatib Celebi saw the decline in 1653. Ibrahim Mutafarrika named the cause in 1731. The diagnosis was correct. The people who received it were unable to act on it, because acting on it would have required them to override a cognitive model that had been fixed during a window that closed decades earlier. They heard the warning. They understood the words. They could not update the operating system that processed the words, because the operating system was no longer accepting updates. It was running the version that was installed during the impressionable years, and that version did not include the possibility that the system it described was failing. This is the position we are all in right now. Every single one of us. I am making this script from inside a generationally calibrated model that I cannot fully see. You are receiving it from inside one you cannot fully see. The scholars I have cited were working from inside their own. The best any of us can do is what Mannheim and Turchin and Goldstone and Inglehart did. We can look at the data across enough generations to see the trajectory that no single generation can perceive from the inside. We can hold the pattern in our minds even though our minds were designed to resist it. And we can choose to take the pattern seriously, even though every instinct generated by our impressionable years model tells us that our particular generation is different, that the pattern applies to other civilizations, but not ours, that the cycle will break this time, because we are more aware, more connected, more informed. The Ottomans were the most sophisticated bureaucracy in the early modern world. They did not break the cycle. The Romans were the most advanced engineering civilization in the ancient world. They did not break the cycle. The Ming were the most technologically capable maritime power in the 15th century. They did not break the cycle. In each case, the generation that could have broken it would have needed to perceive the trajectory from outside its own model, act on information that its own cognitive filter classified as irrelevant, and sacrifice the comforts that its own formative experience had taught it to treat as normal. That is the ask. That has always been the ask. And in over 200 documented cases in Turchin's Crisis DB, it has been met with the same response. The generation in power does what makes sense from inside its own model. The model is wrong, and the pattern continues. So let me pull this together, because the picture I have been building has a shape, and the shape is not what you expect. The standard way this story gets told, on the rare occasions it gets told at all, is as a culture war narrative. Boomers versus millennials. Traditional values versus progressive values. Hard-working previous generations versus entitled current ones. Or, from the other direction, selfish previous generations versus idealistic current ones who cannot afford houses. Pick your team. Argue on the internet. Nothing changes. But that framing is a distraction. It is a distraction because it assumes the disagreement is about values, and that the solution is for one side to win the argument. What the data actually shows is that the disagreement is not about values at all. It is about reality. Each generation's model of what is happening is calibrated to a different set of formative conditions, conditions that no longer exist, and the models are diverging faster than the institutions can adapt. The argument about values is the surface. The structural failure is underneath. Let me make this concrete. When a 68-year-old retired engineer says society works, he means something like this. If you get a degree, you will get a stable job. If you work hard, your wages will keep pace with inflation. If you save, you will be able to buy a house and retire. The government may not be perfect, but the institutions are fundamentally legitimate. Trust in them may require some effort, but it is rational. This is the model his brain built between 1970 and 1983, during his impressionable years, because that is what the data showed during that window. And his model is not wrong for the world that existed when he was 22. For the world that exists now, it is somewhere between incomplete and fictional, but he cannot update it. Giuliano and Spilimbergo showed that the imprinting is permanent. He will carry this model until he dies. When a 26-year-old graphic designer says, "Society works," she means something like this. If you get a degree, you will get debt. The job market is a lottery. Your wages will not keep pace with housing costs. The institutions are not illegitimate, so much as irrelevant. They were designed for a world that no longer exists. Trust in them is not rational. It is nostalgic. Her model was built between 2016 and 2024, during her impressionable years, because that is what the data showed during that window. And her model is not wrong either. For the world she experienced, she has never lived in the world the 68-year-old is describing. She has no experiential access to it. It is as foreign to her as the Ming treasure fleet was to the bureaucrats who burned its records. And here is the structural trap. Both of them are right about the world they experienced. Neither of them is right about the world the other one experienced and the institutions they share. The government, the economy, the legal system, the educational system were designed by a generation whose model of reality is now shared by a shrinking and aging minority of the population. The institutional inheritance is intact. The Asabiyyah that built it is gone. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this instantly. The third generation has lost the taste for group feeling. They are dominated by force. Luxury has reached its peak among them. The language of solidarity still exists. The feeling behind it has evaporated. And the fourth generation, the one that presides over collapse, does not experience the collapse as collapse. They experience it as normal, because their baseline has already shifted. I want to bring in one more piece of the historical record here, because I think it is the piece that makes this pattern impossible to dismiss as an academic exercise. The Ottoman Empire knew it was declining. This is not a retroactive judgment by Western historians. Ottoman intellectuals diagnosed the problem in real time and wrote it down. In 1653, an Ottoman scholar named Khatib Celebi published a work called Dustur al-Amal, which translates roughly as Rules for Action, in which he explicitly warned the Ottoman elite that they needed to learn Western scientific and technological disciplines or face permanent subordination. He saw the gap. He named it. He was ignored. Almost 80 years later, in 1731, a Hungarian-born Ottoman intellectual named Ibrahim Mutafarrika published a remarkable document called Usul al-Hikam fi Nizam al-Umam, the basis of wisdom in the arrangement of nations. And in it, he asked the Ottoman Sultan directly a question that should echo across centuries. He asked why the Christian nations, which were so weak in the past, compared with Muslim nations, had begun to dominate so many lands in modern times, and even to defeat the once victorious Ottoman armies. And his answer was devastating in its clarity. Because they have laws and rules invented by reason. The Ottomans had the diagnosis. They had it in writing. They had intellectuals willing to say it out loud. And nothing changed. Not because the analysis was wrong, not because there was a conspiracy to suppress it, But because the generation in power had a model of how the world works that did not include the possibility that their model was obsolete, their formative experience had taught them that Ottoman institutions were superior. Their lived reality was confirming, through every mechanism of institutional self-reinforcement, that the system was fine. The warnings came from outside the dominant cohort's framework, and information that arrives from outside the framework does not register as information. It registers as noise. This is Mannheim's cognitive filter in action. The formative experience does not just shape your opinions. It shapes what data you are capable of perceiving as relevant. And if the data that would save you is data that your generational filter classifies as irrelevant, you will not process it. You will not suppress it. You will simply not see it. The Ottomans had the data for 80 years, from Khatib Celebi in 1653 to Ibrahim Mutafarrika in 1731 and beyond, and they did not process it, not because they were stupid. The Ottoman Empire produced some of the finest scholars and administrators in human history, but because the information required updating a generational model that could not be updated, the imprinting was too deep. The baseline had already shifted. The generation that could have acted on the warning had formed its worldview in a period when the warning was not yet relevant. And by the time it was relevant, the new generation forming its worldview had already internalized the decline as normal. And if you are sitting there thinking, that could not happen now, we are too self-aware, we have too much data, we have meta-analyses and feedback loops and institutional learning, then I need you to explain the Pew Research Center's 2023 retreat, because that is exactly the same mechanism. An institution that had spent 3 decades measuring generational divergence decided to stop measuring it right when the divergence became most consequential, not because the measurements were wrong, but because the implications were uncomfortable. The data was too good, the pattern was too clear, and the pattern pointed to conclusions that the institution was not prepared to endorse. This is what institutional abdication looks like from the inside. It does not feel like a cover-up. It feels like methodological caution. It feels like scientific humility. It feels like the responsible thing to do. And from the outside, looking at the pattern across 2,400 years of documented institutional behavior, it looks identical to the Confucian literati deciding that Zheng He's records contained deceitful exaggerations. It looks identical to the physics establishment deciding that Bell's theorem was not a proper problem. It looks identical to the Ottoman court deciding that Khatib Celebi's warnings were interesting, but not actionable. The institution preserves its coherence by refusing to follow its own findings to their logical conclusion, and the population, lacking the findings, continues to operate from whatever generational baseline it was born into, unaware that the baseline has shifted, unaware that the shift follows a measurable pattern, and unaware that the pattern has a known endpoint. And now I need to tell you about the endpoint, because I have been building towards something for this entire script, and I have been deferring it, and you have probably sensed it approaching, and I am not going to make it comfortable. The endpoint is not a specific event. It is not a date on a calendar. It is not a war or a revolution or a financial crash, although Turchin's Crisis DB suggests that 75% of the time, those are how the endpoint expresses itself. The endpoint is the moment when the divergence between generational models becomes so wide that no shared institutional framework can contain it. The moment when the word society has so many incompatible definitions in active use that the concept itself ceases to function as a coordinating mechanism. Think about what a society actually is. Stripped of the mythology, it is a set of agreements agreements about what constitutes legitimate authority, agreements about what constitutes fair exchange, agreements about what we owe each other, agreements about what the rules are and who enforces them. And these agreements only work if the parties to them are operating from approximately the same understanding of what the agreements mean. The World Values Survey shows that the youngest cohorts in advanced democracies and the oldest cohorts in those same democracies disagree by 20 to 40 percentage points on questions that directly define those agreements, whether authority should be obeyed because it is authority, whether individual autonomy is more important than social cohesion, whether national identity is defined by ethnic and cultural continuity or by universal principles, whether success is earned or distributed by structural advantage. These are not policy disputes. These are definitional conflicts about what the social contract contains. And the Gallup data shows that the youngest cohorts do not trust any of the institutions through which those agreements are negotiated and enforced. Congress, 17%. The presidency, 17%. The courts, 24%. The media, 28%. When more than 3/4 of the youngest adult generation has functionally zero trust in the legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government, and in the information infrastructure that connects citizens to those branches, the social contract is not being renegotiated. It is being abandoned, quietly, generationally, one cohort at a time, without anyone formally announcing that it is happening. And simultaneously, the cognitive baseline is shifting. The capacity for abstract reasoning that the IQ tests measure has been declining within families in multiple developed countries since the mid-1970s. The neural circuitry that supports spatial navigation is atrophying under GPS dependence. The capacity for critical thinking is being self-reported as absent on 40% of AI-assisted tasks. And each generation accepts its degraded baseline as normal, because each generation's formative experience occurred in the already degraded environment and was never compared to anything else. This is what I meant when I said the shape looks like collapse. It is not a dramatic event. It is a progressive failure of coherence. The agreements that constitute society are being defined differently by each cohort. The trust that makes those agreements functional is eroding generationally. The competency to maintain the systems that everyone depends on is being redistributed from human brains to technological infrastructure that each generation uses, but fewer and fewer understand. And the baseline against which all of this is evaluated shifts downward with every new cohort, making the cumulative degradation invisible to the people living through it. Polybius described this 2,200 years ago. The grandchildren of democracy's founders have become so accustomed to freedom and equality that they no longer value them and begin to aim at preeminence. He was not describing a moral failure. He was describing a structural inevitability. You cannot inherit the formative experience that created the values you received. You can only inherit the institutions. And institutions without the values that animated them are shells. They look functional from the outside. They perform the motions. But the thing that made them work, the shared understanding of why they exist and what they're for, has been lost, not through failure, through success. The institutions worked so well that they eliminated the conditions that made people understand why they were needed. Vaccination eliminated polio so effectively that a generation grew up not knowing what polio was and demanded the right to not be vaccinated. The post-war social contract created such prosperity that a generation grew up not knowing what the absence of prosperity felt like and began to dismantle the contract. Democratic institutions created such freedom that a generation grew up not knowing what the absence of freedom meant and began to treat freedom as an inconvenience rather than an achievement. The Asabiyyah of the founders was spent. The third generation has completely forgotten the desert life. And I want to return at the end of all of this to Liu Daxie, standing in the archive of the Ming Ministry of War in 1477, holding the records of the greatest naval expeditions in human history, knowing exactly what he was holding, and deciding to destroy it. Not because he was a fool, not because he did not understand what the documents represented, but because he understood perfectly, and what they represented was incompatible with his generation's model of what society needed. His generation had decided that China's future was inward, continental, Confucian. The ocean was a distraction. The fleet was a waste. The records were dangerous because they might tempt a future generation to look outward again. He was protecting his generation's definition of society works, and in doing so, he erased his predecessor's definition. And within 50 years, the competency was gone, not because it was too hard to maintain, because the generation decided it was not worth maintaining. I spent a long time trying to figure out what makes this pattern so difficult to see when you are inside it. And I think the answer is that the pattern is not hidden. It is visible. Ibn Khaldun described it in 1377. Plato described it before that. Polybius described it between them. Mannheim formalized it in 1928. Inglehart measured it starting in 1971. Goldstone modeled it in 1991. Turchin predicted it in 2010. The data has been published. The models have been tested. The pattern has been identified, quantified, and peer-reviewed. But seeing the pattern requires comparing your current reality to a baseline that existed before you were born. And that is the one thing the human brain cannot do. Your brain builds its model of normal from the conditions that existed during your formative years. Everything before that is history, which means it is information without emotional weight. And everything after that is filtered through the model that was already built. The pattern is visible in the data. It is invisible in the experience. Every generation agrees that society works. They agree because society, as they perceive it, as it exists within their generationally calibrated model, does work. The 68-year-old is correct that the world he grew up in worked. The 26-year-old is correct that the world she grew up in works differently. Both are correct. Both are inside a model that was built during a specific window. And neither can perceive the trajectory, the direction of cumulative change that connects their models to the models that came before them. The fisheries scientist cannot perceive the decline because she calibrated to the ocean she first studied. The generation cannot perceive the erosion because it calibrated to the society it first inhabited. And the trajectory, the one that connects Plato to Polybius, to Ibn Khaldun, to Mannheim, to Inglehart, to Turchin, the one that runs through the Bronze Age collapse and the fall of Rome, and the Ming self-immolation and the Ottoman diagnosis without action, and the current moment, that trajectory is not ambiguous. It has been measured, it has been modeled. 3 independent frameworks converge on the same window. The window opened around 2020. We are 5 years in. Turchin's Crisis DB contains over 200 cases. In 75%, the crisis ended in revolution or civil war. In 60%, the political entity ceased to exist. The average duration from onset to resolution is decades, not years, decades. And the mechanism that drives the crisis, the one that connects all the other variables, the immiseration, the elite overproduction, the fiscal stress, is the same mechanism that Plato described and Polybius named. and Ibn Khaldun timed, and Mannheim formalized, and Engelhardt measured. It is the progressive inability of successive generations to share a common definition of what their society is, what it is for, and what is required to maintain it. Every generation agrees that society works until you compare what they actually mean. And when you compare what they actually mean across the full sweep of history, across the full body of data, across three independent mathematical models that converge on the same window, you find that the divergence is not a bug. It is the mechanism. It is how complex societies process their own exploration, one generation at a time. Each one correct about its own experience, each one blind to the trajectory, each one holding a map of a country that no longer exists, and navigating with full confidence into terrain that the map does not describe. The map is not the territory. It was never the territory, and the territory is shifting under all of us at a rate that has been calculated along a curve that has been published, toward an outcome that has been documented 200 times in a database that almost nobody outside of academic Cliodynamics has ever heard of. Ibn Khaldun gave us 120 years. Strauss and Howe gave us 80 to 100. Turchin gave us a date. The date was 2020. He published it in Nature, a decade in advance, and nobody acted on it. Not because they did not believe the math, but because acting on it would have required a generation of leaders to accept that their model of reality, the one burned into their brains between the ages of 18 and 25, was no longer adequate to describe the world they were governing. And that is the one thing the mechanism does not allow.